podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So one of the avenues that this podcast has kind of organically started to explore are really the different emerging industries that we are seeing more and more of today. I think the reason for this is that not only will they lead to substantial job growth over time, but they may actually be a space for the industries that are seeing their jobs being replaced by automation technologies today. So on that note, in today's episode, we revisit the new space economy, which of course has been getting a lot of media attention in the last few years due to its growth, charismatic leaders, and of course the interesting future projects and potential subsequent both social but also economic impacts. However, one of the growing challenges for the industry is of course tracking both the satellites and the debris that is already out in space in order to avoid the number of collisions that are possible. And this gets more problematic every single year as more satellites enter the Earth's orbit. So to explain how this will play out, the industry, potential job impact, and of course the future vision, is Araz Feyzi. He's the co-founder and CTO of Kayhan Space. So Araz is an engineer and data scientist by training with a master's in information systems and has been part of two successful startups besides Kayhan Space. He joined Duetto, a B2B software as a service startup, as an early employee and left to co-found Cypher, a cybersecurity startup. He has over 10 years of experience in technology and analytics, working for startups as well as Fortune 500 companies, and I was lucky enough to talk to him about this exciting new industry on today's episode. Great, Araz, thank you very much for coming onto the Automated podcast. It's great to have you here to speak about the new space economy, the work that you guys are doing. Thanks for coming on today.
Mark, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation, to some of the insights that you can bring. One of the ways that I like to start with all my guests, though, is to get a little bit more of a personal interest side of things, right? So, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about space. We'll be talking about the new space economy. Everybody's always looking to Elon Musk, SpaceX, even Jeff Bezos and the Blue Origin work that they're doing. But what got you initially interested in space, in having a startup, working in the things that you do?
That's a great question. So, every kid, most kids are interested in space when they grow up. And I just happened to be interested in astronomy and amateur astronomy when I was in high school. We did some work with friends. We had a small group of, amateur astronomy that we, used to just go out and watch events, stuff like that. But I didn't get into space until we started this company. My background, I'm a technologist. My background is in product development and cloud computing, analytics. I've been programming since I was a kid. So my expertise over time has developed to be leveraging the best and the greatest offerings of cloud computing and technology. Partner with somebody within the industry with deep industry expertise and try to find and solve a problem for that industry. And the story goes back about 2 years ago when my very close friend of mine, my co-founder now, Siamak, we were talking and he was, kind of complaining that, hey, I've been hired for the third time by the third company to build the exact same capability for them. And we kind of paused and we said, well, maybe there's an opportunity here to contribute to the industry. And his background is in aerospace. He has a PhD in aerospace engineering with concentration and focus on precise orbit determination and estimation. He's an astrodynamicist. He has led and supported various NASA, JPL, and commercial missions. So he's the guy with deep industry expertise. And so we sat down. We spent about almost 9 months kind of toying with different ideas of how our expertise together can help this industry. And obviously, it was kind of a throwback to my interests from when I was younger. So that's how we got into that's how I got into this industry today.
Okay, great. I mean, why don't we just jump right into the actual industry itself? Because I think this is something that's always very interesting for people to hear. Also, maybe a little bit beyond the kind of typical, as I mentioned, SpaceX, Blue Origin, etc. Um, so the Mars mission is kind of one of the main things that gets, I think, a lot of the hype cycle, right? Most of the media attention. Uh, Most people that aren't really paying attention to the space economy focus on things like that, the kind of bigger news. But I think as you're more entrenched in the industry, maybe could you touch on some of the things that are exciting you for the next maybe 5, 10 years that maybe some of us haven't heard of before? Kind of like the larger projects that are coming out.
Yeah. So, Mars project, it's fantastic. A lot of technologies are going to come out of all these missions that we're planning on to go to Mars and beyond. But to take a step back and focus on what is important to us today, I want to talk about Earth orbit. Most people, when they talk about Earth orbit or space in general, they believe that it's an unlimited kind of resource that we have. But the reality is that the usable Earth orbit or orbital environment is a couple hundred kilometers above Earth. Obviously, we have geostationary satellites that are further out. But most of the technologies that we rely on are much closer to Earth, and it's a very finite, it's a very limited amount of kind of space around us, or orbit around Earth. And so we have satellites that are supporting trillion-dollar industries here on Earth. So think about global supply chain, think about GPS, think about communication, entertainment, agriculture, defense. Our everyday life, our modern life is dependent on space, basically continuously 24/7, right? And there are a couple of problems that we're facing today, and these problems are going to kind of grow as we launch more satellites into space, that are threatening the sustainability in Earth orbit, which is indirectly threatening the way we live our lives today. Right. And that is what's exciting the most today, because it is a problem that exists. It is a problem that is directly affecting our lives today. And we're focused on addressing the issues in Earth orbit or orbital environment. Just to put it in perspective, in the first 6-7 decades of space age, right, old space age, since 1960s, until recently, we had launched about 8,000 satellites, give or take. 2,000 of which are still operational. 6,000 have either kind of decommissioned, still in orbit, they've turned to debris, or they've come down to Earth or burnt in the atmosphere. Just in the 2020 to 2021 timeframe, SpaceX alone has launched 1,400 satellites, right? So they've become the largest satellite operator in the world within a year and a half. Now, if you look at the forecast, we're planning on launching somewhere between 40 to 60,000 satellites in the next decade. You have mega constellations. If you just look at the planned ones, Amazon Kuiper, you have OneWeb, you have the China's mega constellation that was just announced. You have the SpaceX's Starlink, and the space around Earth is getting congested as we launch more satellites. So if we stop launching a single satellite today, we would still be in trouble, because Earth orbit has a carrying capacity, and per recent estimates, 95% of that is already taken by space debris or space junk. So just that is the problem that we're really excited about, and we're trying to bring the technology that will help guarantee that we'll have a sustainable orbital environment around Earth for the next generations to come.
Right. So it sounds like there's a couple different challenges then for this entire new space economy, right? You touched on the kind of limited carrying capacity, the limited space in space, and then maybe also you can touch a little bit further on the space debris, because I think this is something that doesn't really get that much attention. I don't think. I've read a couple articles back when I had Asgard Space on. Our mutual contact, and there was I think some crazy number, like several million pieces of space debris from like a single paint speck, right, all the way to one of these larger decommissioned satellites that are still just kind of floating around, not really doing anything other than taking up space and potentially causing some kind of collisions. Could you touch on that a little bit more? Because I think it's quite interesting, especially as you've kind of painted this vision of kind of an exponential growth of satellites and other kind of technologies that'll be taking up our limited space.
Yeah. So how do we know space orbital debris exists? So there's a U.S. started something called Space Surveillance Network back in the day, and today it's a combination of Earth radars and telescopes and on orbit assets and laser ranging tools. The initial purpose of this network was to detect ballistic missiles, but as a byproduct of that, we started seeing objects in orbit, and then the way it's evolved, and it continues to evolve. It is scanning Earth orbit for all the pieces that it can see. So right now we can see using space SSN, we can see objects that are larger than 10 centimeters in diameter. So U.S. Space Force, used to be U.S. Air Force, now U.S. Space Force, catalogs somewhere between 20 to 30,000 objects that we can see. So these are objects that they could be natural debris, or they could be man-made debris that, as you said, it can be just a piece of paint that came off of a launch vehicle, or it can be a second stage that we left in orbit, or a decommissioned satellite. Now, it's estimated that there are about 1 million pieces of debris in Earth orbit. And that's the estimate, because we can't see anything smaller than 10 centimeters diameter. Now, a new radar came online, I believe, last year, called Space Fence, that is operated by SSN, that is capable of seeing much smaller objects, about 3 centimeters and large. It's expected that once this radar's data is ingested into the catalog, we'll be able to see over 100,000 objects. So the reality is, the more we look, the more we find.
Yeah.
Now, these objects. So so these objects are flying at 20,000 miles an hour. That's about 10 to 17 times the speed of a bullet. Now, at that speed, if a fragment size of a penny, if it hits a satellite, it will destroy it into pieces. And when that happens, and if that happens, it doesn't just end that particular mission. The debris from that collision, that can be in thousands of pieces, will stay in orbit for tens or hundreds of years. And each one of those become another piece of debris that would threaten the asset. So it's not, Gravity movie came out, right? So that is actually based on true science. Kessler syndrome was introduced by Kessler in the 1970s. And it's a chain reaction. So if you have one collision, the debris from that hits other assets, destroys those, and it causes a chain reaction that can basically make an entire orbit unusable for generations. Yeah. So it is an extremely difficult problem. And again, as I mentioned, even if we stop launching a single satellite today, we still have to deal with this growing pain of, hey, we have all these collisions that we have to avoid. And it happens on a daily basis. Satellite operators perform maneuvers to avoid collisions with other operational satellites or orbital debris on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
And it gets worse. Sorry to interrupt you. And it gets worse because when you have an asset that you can maneuver, it's easier because you don't even maneuver it out of the way. But when you have two objects that are not maneuverable, and then they're at risk of colliding, there's nothing you can do, and that's the worst case scenario, which we had one of them a couple of months ago when two giant pieces of debris got very close together. So when we talk about things like the latest Chinese rocket body that was left in orbit that came down a few days ago, that's a big problem because you have 20 plus tons of material. And if that 20-ton object collides with another object, it will create so many pieces of debris that can create a cascading effect for other operators. And it's not about just about the satellites that are currently in orbit. If you try to launch anything into space, you got to go through the lower Earth orbit. So one of the products that, for example, we have is called launch conjunction assessment. When you're launching a new launch vehicle, you want to make sure that from first stage, second stage, payload, all of the other components are not going to collide with anything. Right. And it was in the news that in April when the when the Dragon was docking with ISS, they had a turned out to be false alarm, which is again underscores the story. But they had to get back into their suits because they thought that there was a close approach with a piece of debris. So it's threatening not just satellites, but human life, and also any kind of mission, whether it's Earth bound or Moon or Mars or beyond. You have to go through this cloud of debris to get out.
And if I can tie this back to what you were saying at the start, where our on-Earth civilization is going to become more and more dependent on these spacefaring systems and assets, as you were mentioning, this risk grows considerably, or I guess you could say the impact of this risk grows considerably. Maybe also then tying it into Kayhan space, where we have all of these new kinds of satellites coming out, right? Starlink and the other ones that you mentioned. What is going to happen if they're not able to be properly tracked, right? Or is there a system out there now that can properly track these things, track the debris, and help them avoid the collisions?
Great question. So tracking is one part of the solution. So the great thing about operating satellites is that, especially the newer ones that are being launched, they all come with GPS on board, and they're at least 1 to 3 units large. So current technologies can very well track these objects. So tracking operational and I guess any kind of large satellite is not a big problem because we can already track those pretty well. So the problem mostly is the ability to track items that we can't track them precisely today. So for example, so if you have a piece of paint that came off of a satellite or a launch vehicle, these are called hammers, a high area to mass ratio. These are, you can imagine, very light but large area, but large kind of in terms of area, it's pretty big. What is wrong with that? Because solar radiation at lack of gravity or low gravity has actually pretty significant effect on movement. So solar radiation or solar rays can actually push an object like that. So and when you're looking from ground, you only see like the radar return that you get tells you there's an object approximately this large. But when you have items like that, then your uncertainty is pretty high to know where they exactly are and where they're going. So I mean, it's a very complex problem to track these objects, and especially the smaller ones. If you have smaller objects, it's just very hard to detect them, and it's very hard to track them. So because you get the snapshot of, okay, so I saw an object going here at this speed or velocity, and then based on that you kind of try to identify those. So identifying, I guess, finding and identifying and cataloging debris is a big problem. So we just need to make sure that they are stayed at a minimum. So that's one big problem. What we are trying to do is that, and so that's one part of the problem. So knowing where operation satellites are, knowing where debris is, those are two parts of the solution. The third one is that how do we avoid these catastrophic collisions? Now, if satellite operators, say you have a satellite that is doing Earth observation, you're up there to perform your mission, which is Earth observation. You're not there to necessarily, avoid collisions. It is a part of the job that you have to do, but it is not necessarily what you're there to do. And right now, in certain orbital regimes, satellite operators are getting hundreds of potential what's called conjunction messages or collision notifications every week from your space source. Okay. And as the number of objects and satellites are increased, you can assume that how quickly that's going to grow, how quickly these scenarios are going to increase. Now, this process that is used today has a couple of issues. So one is not scalable. So you have people usually just looking at these emails and doing some analysis in-house, and then then they bring people together, they decide whether or not they need to perform a maneuver, they design a maneuver, they screen it to make sure that once they perform that maneuver, it won't result in another accident. And then they finally either do a maneuver or not. It's time consuming, it's not scalable. Human is in critical path of the response, so there are delays introduced, and there's human errors introduced. We've had human errors in the past that almost resulted in collisions. So what we believe needs to be done is that we believe that there needs to be, we need better automation and autonomy in avoiding certain collisions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just because it's not humanly possible to have a constellation of thousands or hundreds, tens of thousands of satellites and do this in a manual fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a lot of smaller operators that are launching satellites. You can be a student group, you can be a startup to launch a satellite, and
Right.
we can't expect every satellite operator to kind of develop these autonomies and these automations to avoid collision. So what we are building, we're building an autonomous satellite collision avoidance system that what it does is it kind of tracks where you're going, tracks all the upcoming conjunctions. We perform trending and analysis in the back end. When you need to know about an
Mm-hmm.
event, we send you a notification. We say, hey, we received 150 notifications today. There's just one that you need to look at. Here's a Slack message. You send it to Slack or Microsoft Teams or Mattermost. And then if we believe that there's a need for a maneuver, for avoidance maneuver, we prepare that based on all the constraints that satellite operator has, and we provide it to them. All they need to do is just upload it to their satellite, review it, upload their satellite, and be done. So that's the technology part that we're developing to help reduce the risk of collisions in space.
Right. Yeah, it still surprises me that the main way that collisions are stopped today is through emails. To me, when I first heard that with the previous guest, it completely blew my mind, because when you think of space, when you think of the new space economy, you think, some of the most high-tech equipment and technology in and outside of our world. So it's really interesting that emails are still kind of the primary way that this is happening. And I guess from my understanding, your platform, your system is going to be a new layer of automation that enables not only the efficiency of these collision avoidances, but also the how should I say, the scaled up version of human notification systems. Especially as if we're going to have some tens of thousands of satellites in the next couple of years, that would mean, I would assume, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individual people to do that tracking, to do the notifying, to send those emails and to stop those collisions. So it sounds really interesting that this automation layer would be able to solve many of these problems that are going to come up.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary. And one thing I would add is that, want to compare, these are terminology in the space industry, old space versus new space. Old space, up until recently, you had to be a government agency or a billion-dollar company, a corporate, to be able to develop design a mission, develop your satellite, launch it, run it, and all of that. But today, you can be a small company or a student group coming out of university, have a sensor. Then you basically go to a company such as, say, Tyvak or Blue Canyon Technology. They will build your satellite for you. You may not even see it. They will send it to a rideshare, for example, say NanoRacks. They will put on NanoRacks. It will go on a Falcon 9 rideshare. It will get to orbit sub 1 million. Then you will work with someone like Azure or AWS. They have ground stations integrated with their systems. You will get your data, analyze it on the cloud, and all of that. But you still, when it comes to risk or a spaceflight safety capabilities, you have to build them in-house. And that is why we started this company, because we believe that this whole category of spaceflight safety as a software hasn't been defined. You still have to build tools to figure out where you are, orbit determination tools. You still have to build automation and tools to avoid collisions. You still have to build technology to figure out what is the most optimal way for you to task your missions, and that's what we're addressing. So our solution is not just satellite collision avoidance. We are building a spaceflight safety software for satellite operators, a turnkey solution that is built for interoperability.
And can you maybe touch on the technology itself a little bit more? Because I think it'd be interesting for a number of the listeners. I would assume that algorithms and some form of AI would be central to this platform, to the system that you're building. Could you touch on that a little bit? I think it'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, sure. This is a very kind of analytical problem. So we have some observations. So there are ground radars. Say there are ground radars that detect our orbital debris, and you have a satellite and that has, let's assume that has a GPS on board. So we get data from ground radars with access to enhanced catalog through APIs, and then we get tracking data from or location data from the GPS. We take that data and we put it through a process called orbit determination. Basically figures out where the object is. And at that point, we can kind of intersect it with the entire catalog of debris and the way they're moving. And so part of this is already done through CSPOC, or the 18th Space Control Squadron, which is operating the space surveillance network. A lot of times we just get a notification from the 18th Space on behalf of our customers saying, hey, we're forecasting or predicting what's called a conjunction or close approach 6 days from now at this time between these two satellites. And then we can, and then that solution gets updated as it gets closer, and we have more accurate data on tracking that gets updated. So we ingest all of that, we do tracking, we analyze it, and if you have more accurate data on either what's called primary, we ingest that, we predict where the object is going, and we run our kind of collision avoidance algorithms, and we provide our customer with all the information they need. So we show them visually how it's going to happen. It's the 3D visualization of the event, all uncertainties, probability of collision, how close they're going to get. So it's a very analytical kind of problem that needs, it's pretty sophisticated to solve. So AI doesn't necessarily add a lot of value in this case. There are other use cases of AI that we are leveraging in other parts of our platform, but not for collision avoidance. It's a problem that can be easily solved through analytical methods.
Right. Okay. Maybe following from that, though, it really sounds like there's still a lot of, I guess, human work to be done on the side of your clients, right? So they receive these notifications, they understand the data that you have sent them is like, okay, there is a collision that's going to happen, but then they still need to take the steps on their own end to stop that collision from happening. What is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, 15 years, something like that? Are your clients going to get a little bit more autonomous? Are you going to be communicating with their systems, with their satellites directly that have the kind of navigational properties that are going to be built into them so that they can avoid things by themselves without having a kind of a team on the ground to solve that? Or is that still light years away?
No, hopefully not light years away, because we can't go, more than a couple of years before this is it becomes feasible. So we are building toward a full autonomy. A couple of things that are, we always discuss is that trust is extremely important when it comes to space missions, because you got to have trust in your systems, you got to have trust in the data. So as a result of that, satellite operators usually check with multiple data sources or multiple solutions, multiple sources, and also they want to review, critical kind of maneuvers and changes. But as we continue to build more integrations, we believe that in the next 2 years or so, we'll be able to get to full autonomy in terms of collision avoidance when it comes to an operational satellite versus a non-operational object. But why do I say that? So if you have two objects that are, one of them is maneuverable, that's let's say the kind of the satellite that we're controlling, and also debris. The debris is not going to move, so pretty much exactly where it's going. Right. So we can decide, well, I want to avoid it. This is the maneuver I'm going to perform. But the problem is when you have multiple operations, or two operational satellites that are about to have a conjunction. So what do you do then? What if they don't talk and they both perform the same maneuver, or and this has happened in the past. So as a result of that, one thing that happened in March was that SpaceX signed an agreement with NASA, saying that anytime there's a conjunction between a Starlink satellite and a NASA asset, NASA is not going to move. So it's very clear. It's going to be on SpaceX to perform the maneuver. And based on the information that is publicly available, Starlink satellites do have an autonomous satellite collision avoidance system which basically, they get data from the ground, and then when there's a need for maneuver, they perform the maneuver. I don't have much detail about how it works.
Yeah.
But as you can imagine, that won't work in cases where you have two operational satellites. Starlink versus OneWeb happened in April. The story is still, developing and changing on that. So we believe that in the next couple of years, we need to come up with, as citizens of the Earth, we need to come up with rules of engagement when it comes to satellite collision avoidance, among other things. So what if, a satellite from, say, two countries that don't have great relationships on a collision? What are you going to do? So it is a problem. So we keep saying that technology alone is not going to be able to solve this problem. You need to get policy involved. You need to have nations come together and come up with norms of operating in space. So what we are doing on technology, from a technology perspective, we are developing a platform that when there are two operational satellites in a collision course and there are clients, they can actually work together to come up with a maneuver plan that's optimized based on both sides, operation constraints.
Okay.
So, hey, satellite A from operator 1, satellite B from operator 2, you have a conjunction, have a chat channel. Here's Kayhan's recommendation in terms of the most optimal maneuver. And so we believe that is something that we can do immediately. That's something that technology can do to help. But on the side, what we do is we speak with our representatives and people, people close to Washington, and try to increase the awareness around this problem. Because we believe that U.S. needs to take the leadership to bring together a coalition of nations to sit down and come up with rules of engagement when it comes to Earth orbit.
Great. I have two quick questions to follow up from that. So one, and I should have asked this before, when there's a conjunction event, how much time in advance do these two items have before they actually collide? Are we talking hours, days, months, week? What's the time frame there?
Great question. So in a lot of cases where both objects are cataloged, which means we know where they are and we have a good kind of history on them, you can have days. Usually we get something, usually 3 to 7 days, you get the first notification, and it changes over time. Sometimes it just disappears because we get better data that, hey, no, they're not close. Or we get more accurate data showing that they're actually closer than what we thought. 3 to 7 days. But that's only between the objects that have been cataloged and we know them relatively well. So the problem with that is that if you have a breakup in orbit, so whether it's a just malfunction, or whether it's a collision with debris or an object, and you have thousands of pieces of debris or tens, doesn't matter. It usually takes a while before ground radars and other tracking technologies to detect and catalog those objects.
Right.
And if you have an object that was just cataloged, and then you could have a solution or could have a conjunction that's hours away. But we don't see it. We don't see that much. Hopefully we'll never see that, because hopefully we won't have any serious significant breakups in orbit. We've had a couple of them over the past 2 decades, but usually on well-defined or well-cataloged objects, about 3 to 7 days.
Okay. And then my other question here was more towards the kind of standards and policies between nations that you were saying. It was quite interesting. The one point was the system that you're building almost seems to have kind of a logical decision, right? So irrespective of which country wants to do what, you're providing a solution that is maybe the most efficient, requires the least amount of resources or fuel, etc. Are you hopeful that this kind of maybe scientific approach to making these decisions will win out at the end of the day? Or are you getting a sense that because there are so many nations that don't necessarily agree within this space region, that there's going to be more political decisions made on how to maneuver the assets in the future compared to this kind of autonomous possibility that's starting to be built out?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I don't I don't think I have the answer. What I can
Mm-hmm.
say is that we're hoping that space will stay, peaceful, and countries will work together to address
Yeah.
these issues. But it's a very complex problem because even, every country, U.S., Russia, China, every country has assets that they don't publicly talk about. Even when you get the catalog information, you realize that some items have been either removed or the data have been kind of manipulated, so you can't really get too much information about them. Um, um, yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of complexities when it comes to national security and how different countries can work together. But we're hoping that major players in space programs, nations come together and come to some sort of an agreement, peaceful agreement, and on rules of the engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I definitely share that view. It would be nice if people can come together, nations can come together, rather than having this kind of confrontation outside of our planet, anyways. Um, so I want to follow up. I do see the time is running down here a little bit. The podcast does focus on the main kind of mega trend of jobs and automation. So we're talking a lot about automation in space. Of course, this is a completely, not completely new, but it's an emerging sector, right? So there's constantly new jobs being created. You touched on kind of the decentralization and the kind of democratization of the assets that can be built, transferred, transported, and then sent out. So you don't actually necessarily need to have an organization, a corporate, to build out these things and send them out anymore. How do you see your system that you're building with its very impressive automation capabilities impacting jobs in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, no, great question. So, our company, among other, there are a couple of companies just like us that we know of that are active in software, space software. We're creating jobs, so we have quadrupled the size of our team in the next year or so. So you have, the sector, the software sector in space has been creating a lot of high-paying jobs or high skilled jobs, and in reality, the jobs that our solution is displacing is actually a kind of talent that we can leverage somewhere else to create a lot more value. Right. So if you have a highly educated, talented, aerospace engineer or astrodynamics engineer, they can be they can create a lot of value focusing on other parts of the space industry than avoiding collisions. So we believe that this is one of those, it's not necessarily we are, replacing low skill jobs. It's not like this sector, this technology is replacing jobs that are needed. We are actually eliminating the kind of task that is risky. It's being done in less efficient manner, and we're releasing the talent, we're basically opening time with talent that is very, very usable and more productive somewhere else.
That's great to hear. That's one of the trends that keeps coming up on the podcast as well, for specific technologies or businesses, right? It's that you're not automating a complete job, but you're automating those tasks within that job, exactly. Therefore freeing up that labor to do something that's more, higher skill needed, or you can use your brain a little bit more and contribute, as you said, towards the sector, towards the business at a higher capacity. That's great to hear. One of the ways that I like to end all these podcast episodes is, we've talked a couple of times about like the future, the next 5 to 10 years. If I could ask you what your future vision is of the space economy, or the new space economy, for let's pick a relative time frame. Let's say 10 years out. Is it going to be a completely autonomous, interconnected system where satellites are talking to each other, they're talking to the radar, they're talking to systems such as yours, they're all maneuvering between each other, and creating great amounts of efficiencies and leading people to do the kind of work that they want to do? Or is there going to be something else thrown into the mix? Kind of what's your vision for them maybe in the next 10 years?
Yeah, obviously it's a very difficult question to answer, and
Hmm.
the odds that I'll be right is very, very low, but I'll
That's why I
try.
ask it.
Yeah, I know. So, well, I'm hoping that in the next 10 years or so, in 10-year mark, we'll have all of the new missions that are launching are going to launch with orbital sustainability in mind,
Hmm.
meaning I'm launching a mission. I want to make sure that all the parts that are involved in that launch come down safely. And I want to make sure that when my satellite, when it gets to the end of life, it decommissions automatically and comes back. So that is the hope. That is one thing that I'm really hoping that will happen, and I'm hopeful that it will happen. Um, but 10-year time frame is quite short for certain kind of missions that have launched or are launching today that are still leveraging kind of older rules and technologies. But I believe what's going to happen is that we're going to have a significant number of mega constellations that are very well automated, very well regulated, and hopefully working together to keep each other and the orbital environment safe. But you're going to have obviously the debris, and you're going to have the older kind of generation satellites that you still have to handle on a case to case basis. But hopefully, we will have autonomy built into the new mega constellation, which is going to be the biggest chunk of the new satellite launches in the next decade.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, Araz, thank you very much for coming on to the Automated Podcast. Especially thanks for that kind of future vision. That's always something that I like to hear from the guests. I'll have the website, Kayhan Space, as well as your LinkedIn up on the show notes. Is there another place that you want listeners to check you out?
Yeah, follow us on Twitter.
Okay.
It's Kayhan Space handle, and follow us on LinkedIn. But yeah, our website is the best place to go. We post our news and also our thoughts on our blog very
Okay.
frequently.
Great.
But yeah, follow us on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thanks you very much for coming on to the podcast, and yeah, thanks for sharing your insights, and all the best with your business. It's very exciting, and I hope that the automation potential really kind of helps out the new space sector.
Mark, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.